Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus with another deck guide. This one is an oddball. It's a deck that does not show up much in Modern these days. I had to look very hard to see any type of updated list for this. That is the deck Skred Red. Now this was a deck that was ironically the very first deck that I played on this channel. A deck that my brother had in paper many years ago in early Modern. And was really kind of the precursor to the mono-red prison decks that kind of are somewhat present these days, the mono-red mid-range popularized by Hayashi. A lot of it can trace its roots from this and from the mono-red stompy list that currently exists in the legacy format. So this is a mono-red mid-range deck that was built around the card Skred. Now this is an era before Fatal Push exists, this is an era before Unholy Heat exists. This is in an era before Solitude and Fury and all these other different things. So you had to try really hard to find good one mana removal in the modern format. Basically, it was Path to Exile, Lightning Bolt, and that was it. Everything else was 2 mana or conditional removal. Skred basically says, when it deals damage to target creature equal to the number of snow permanents you control, all of your lands are snow permanents. Generally, this led to a game plan where you were trying to play a bunch of snow-covered mountains and just kill your opponent with a Skred. So you got to pair Lightning Bolt with Skred. Beyond that, you're just a mono-red mid-range deck. You have a little bit of ramp in the form of things like Mind Stone. And then you play the powerful but very situational power Planeswalker, Koth of the Hammer. Now this is one from Scars of Mirrodin, one of the very first Planeswalkers in Magic's history, or at least within the first couple years of it, so maybe not as broken as some of the ones that we're used to. +1, untap target mountain, becomes a 4/4 red elemental creature until the end of turn. It's a land. Does not gain haste, which can be important, makes it important to target the right one. It's -2 ability, very powerful. Add 1 red for each mountain you control. This can really let you get ahead on mana. And then finally, a -5, which can win the game through almost any situation, which is mountains you control have tap. This land deals 1 damage to any target. If you've been controlling the game like a good mid-range control deck will do, this can close out the game over a couple of turns. Oftentimes you'd see things like Ensnaring Bridge to slow down the game or a bunch of sweepers. But the rest of the deck, you play some decent threats. You play things like Relic of Progenitus as ways to kind of control the graveyard, as well as having cantrips. Mind Stone was usually the ramp spell of choice, allowing you to cash it in for a card later. Then, obviously, you're going to play a mono-red deck, you may as well play Blood Moon. And this was one of the few decks that really could kind of take advantage of Blood Moon back in the day. Then Anger of the Gods was usually the sweeper of choice. Sometimes you would see different versions playing things like, there's other red sweepers, but Anger of the Gods was usually the choice. And then Piankira Nolar was actually a threat in this deck at that point, along with Stormbright Dragon as ways to close out the game. Chandra Torch of Defiance would see play. And then finally, Batterskull would be kind of a threat, as well as sometimes Wormcoil Engine. This particular version, I think, is the last time that Skred Red had a relevant finish. That was a first place finish back in 2016. I was playing Eternal Scourge. This one's a weird one. Whenever it becomes a target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, exile Eternal Scourge. Then you can cast it from exile. Then you can also use Relic of Progenitus potentially to rebuy it. So, weird one. Didn't see play in all the Skred Red lists back in the day, but was certainly a card to be aware of. Scrying Sheets was another powerful thing in this deck. Allowed you to get through land pockets quite nicely. Also allows you to have more snow permanents, that has a little bit of utility instead of just playing all mountains. And then one of Magma Jet. This was kind of here for card selection in addition to dealing with early creature rushes. Sideboard was a mess. You didn't have all the cool tools that Red has these days. Usually you would see some amount of pressure, Goblin Rabble Master, later Legion War Boss, just as a way to bring in more pressure against decks like Blue-White Control and such back in the day. Ricochet Trap to fight over counter spells, as well as fighting over Cascade spells, etc. Molten Rain as kind of a pseudo land destruction plan against decks like Tron and that back in the day. Dragon's Claw, this was your tech against burn and potentially aggressive decks. Grafdigger's Cage to pair with your Relic of Progenitus against any type of graveyard nonsense. And then Shattering Spree against any type of artifact decks, keeping in mind that Affinity was still a thing back then because of Mox Opal not being banned yet. So that was the deck back in the day. Now there's been a few attempts to update the deck. It's not really gained much traction. The first version was this. This was more akin to a slightly updated version of the deck. Still seeing a lot of the same cards, still seeing scrying sheets. Mouth of Renam, which basically is a removal spell on a land, dealing 4 damage to a creature. Frostwalk Bastion, a slightly lower powered version of the one that sees Frosthaven. Why can I know? Faceless Haven. So this is a 2/3 that whenever it deals combat to a creature, tap that creature, doesn't untap, and then until end of turn, Frostwalk Bastion becomes a 2/3 construct. It's still a land, so you could easily play Faceless Haven in that slot. You're still seeing a bunch of the same cards. Braid as an updated removal spell, Pirate Spellbomb as a one-of to deal with annoying things like Sanctifier and such, as this list was within the last couple of years. Chandra Acolyte of Flame pairs quite nicely with both Chandra Torch of Defiance and Koth. It's 0, obviously giving you loyalty on your red planeswalkers, which means you can get your ultimates faster, so you don't have to defend your planeswalkers quite as long. And then, obviously the create 2 tokens gives you a little bit of pressure against control decks and such. Koth still as a 2-of is fine. Oftentimes, having played the deck a lot when it was, much more relevant, drawing multiple costs could be a little bit awkward, but, a couple of definitely very powerful. Chandra Torch of Defiance, obviously a very powerful card. Then a split on Stormbreath Dragon and Glorybringer. Glorybringer obviously better against creature decks. Stormbreath Dragon better against white X control, with protection from things like Solitude, March of Otherworldly Light, etc. Prismatic Ending if they happen to get to that. Leyline Binding also kind of relevant. And then you see a much more semi-updated sideboard. You have Shenanigans and Shattering Spree against any type of Urza Saga nonsense. Dragon's Claw still the tech against burn and such. Ratchet Bomb when you need additional answers to things like Sanctifier and Vec, etc. Void Mirror as kind of the answer to the Cascade nonsense that was starting to pop up more and more about a year ago when this deck was played. Anger to pair with your other Angers. Boil for blue decks. Ricochet Trap to fight over counterspells. Chandra Awakened Inferno as a way to fight through various different counterspell decks. The final version, which I find interesting, was played by 3BenU about a year and a half ago. Now, this is not the same as your typical Skred Red decks. This one's a little bit more of like a red-ish stompy deck. You start obviously with Ragavan, the nimble annoying monkey. Pair that with Skred and Lightning Bolt and still your early Relic of Progenitus, keep graveyard gate decks in check. The weird one to me though is Blood Moon with Urza's Saga. Not sure I agree with this deck building, but it does give you a little bit of interesting stuff going on. Then obviously Bone Crusher Giant, Rabble Master, Seasoned Pyro, Easy Ways to kind of fix all the mana or get to the early problems and leverage Ragavan. Chandra Torch of Defiance as a way to kind of win the game, deal with your opponent's creatures, etc. Karn the Great Creator with a small wish board that we'll talk about in a minute. Good idea for this deck. And then obviously I think the biggest inclusion to the deck, if it were to be played more these days, is Fury. You basically don't play a red mid-range deck without it. Sideboard, still see a lot of the same stuff. You still see 3 copies of Boil for all the blue decks running around. Ensnaring Bridge as a way to slow the game down. Liquid Metal Coating to blow up some lands. Dragon's Claw against Burn. Cage against Graveyard nonsense as well. Don't think it stops creativity because of the way creativity is worded, but stops Graveyard nonsense, except Living End, which you probably want to switch it out for another Graveyard hate piece these days. Shattering Spree for any type of Urza Saga nonsense. And a full playset of Chalice of the Void for your various Cascade decks. Now, where do I see this deck in the meta currently? Now, obviously, there are red decks that already exist. You have, at the top end, you have decks like Burn. You have decks like Mono Red Prowess, or Is It Prowess, those kind of decks. You also have the Hayashi Red and the Red Prison decks. This deck is probably somewhere in the range of Hayashi Red and Red Prison, with obviously the only huge difference between the decks being the presence of Skred in the deck. Do I think this is worth bending her over backwards to play? Probably not. I think the mana curve on this deck is way too high for the number of lands. If I were to rebuild Skred, I would probably definitely include Ragavan. Another card that I would definitely include would be Fable of the Mirror Breaker. Still obviously a Blood Moon deck. Whether I would include copies of Koth or not, I'm not sure. I do know that Karn the Great Creator makes a lot of sense in this style of deck, as well as Shoner Torch of Defiance. And then obviously copies of Fury at the top end, kind of replacing the old Stormbreath Dragon Glory Bringer package. Now, I do think like a 4-2-2 split on Koth, Chandra, and Karn, with Banner being 4 copies of Karn, because I think Koth plays quite nicely with Karn in terms of that mana boost, being able to cast things like Ensnaring Bridge and such out of the sideboard. I would certainly have to tinker with that kind of stuff, but Skred Red obviously is a deck that has not seen some play in quite some time. Now, I do have a lot of old Skred Red content on the channel. If you want to check that out, it'll be part of the playlist with this. But as a deck we might try to do a little bit of iterating on, as I'm trying to do a little bit of gameplay on all the major archetypes through Modern's history, if they're remotely playable these days and haven't been banned out of existence. But don't know how I feel about the Urza Saga Blood Moon thing. Obviously, the draw of the deck was red-based removal, Blood Moon. A lot of decks have kind of supplanted this deck with what they do. Decks like Team of Rhinos, decks like Is It Murktide, Rakdos Scam. All of these are kind of decks that kind of do the same thing that this deck does, but much better, much more updated. You still have Hayashi Red, you still have Mono Red Prison that pops up now and again. So maybe there is a place for this style of deck in the format. It was always weak to spell-based combo, which right now is kind of in an all-time low, unless you're talking about a deck like Rhinos or Living In, which it does have some counterplay too. And you no longer have to play Anger of the Gods when your main deck is a sweeper. You now have Fury. So you have a threat that's also a sweeper. So quite nice in that regard. But yeah, definitely a deck that has a soft place in my heart. I played it some in paper when I was first getting into Modern. I've also played it some online. It's been a long time since I picked up the deck, so I can't say that it's a good choice for Modern, but still a deck that maybe you should be aware of. Maybe there's some crazy wizard at your local store that pilots this deck, and they're wondering what's this crazy pile that they're playing. If you see Snow-Covered Mountains and you see a 1-mana removal spell, this is probably what they're playing. But if you like this kind of content, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hope to see you for our next Modern video.